So out of all of the useful tips that you laid out in the book, what are the three most important things that you think everyone today should leave with to be a better communicator?
Yeah. So I should talk a little bit about how this book started. I fell into this pattern a couple of years ago that I'm assuming many of the people in the audience are familiar with, which is that I would come home from work after a long day and I would start complaining to my wife about my day and tell her, my boss doesn't appreciate me. My coworkers you don't realize what a genius I am. And my wife would often offer me this great advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better. And the interesting thing was that instead of being able to hear her advice, I'd get even more upset. Right? I would say something like, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. Why don't you agree with me that they're all dumb and I'm a genius? And then she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And this is a pattern that I'm assuming many of the people watching that we always fall into, right? Not always, that we often fall into with our spouses, where one person has a problem, the other person tries to solve that problem, and we don't appreciate it. And so I went to researchers and I asked them, sort of what's going on here? Like, why does this happen? Because it wasn't just at home that this would happen. At work, I was working at the New York Times at that point, and they made me a manager. And I was pretty good at like logistics and strategy, but the parts of being a manager that involves communication, I turned out to be terrible at. And so I went to these researchers and I asked them why. And one of the things they told me is that they've been so they said we're actually living through this golden age of understanding communication for really the first time because of advances in neural imaging and data collection. We know what's happening inside people's brains as they go about having their daily lives and having conversations. And they said, here's one of the big insights. We tend to think of a conversation or a discussion as being about one thing, right? We're talking about our kids' grades or where to go on vacation or what our day was like. But what the researcher said is if we look at your brain, what we see is that every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And in those conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There are these conversations that are practical, right? Where we're talking about making plans or solving problems together. But then there's also emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize and relate. And then finally, there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other, how the social identities that are important to us, how we relate to society. And what the researchers told me is one of the things that we've discovered is if two people are having different kinds of conversations, it's almost impossible for them to fully hear each other and feel connected. Right? This is exactly what was happening with me and my wife. I was having an emotional conversation. My wife was having a practical conversation. They're both equally legitimate forms of communication, but because they were different, we couldn't really hear each other. We couldn't really connect with each other. What the researchers have found is that alternately, when we have the same kind of conversation at the same moment, then we begin to hear each other much better. Our brains actually begin to look similar. When you're in a great conversation with someone, your breath starts to match theirs. Your heart rate starts to match theirs. Most importantly, the ideas inside your head, if we were looking at your neural activity, what we would see is that it's becoming more and more similar. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it, because if I tell you about an emotion I'm feeling, you actually experience that emotion a little bit. Or if I tell you about an idea, you experience that idea. And so as our brains become synchronized, what in neuroscience is known as neural entrainment, we are able to understand each other more clearly. And more importantly, we feel connected to each other. We trust each other more. We like each other more. We think the other person's smarter. Now, within psychology, this has become known as the matching principle. And what the matching principle says is that only by having the same kind of conversation at the same moment can we actually connect with each other. And so it's important to diagnose what kind of conversation is happening and then match the other person or invite them to match you.
That's incredibly interesting. And I guess, for our community, it's incredibly important to understand these practical insights that we can apply, to our personal, but also to our professional lives. Is there anything in your career that you had to solve that you challenged, that you faced, that led you to develop this framework? You've mentioned now your relationship with your wife. Does that same things, the same principle apply for relationships at work?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the question is, once we decide to apply this principle at work or at home or in it with anyone, right? If we're having a conversation, that the question becomes, how do we figure out what kind of conversation is occurring? How do we connect with someone and know what kind of mindset they're in? And what the research tells us is that there's basically one technique for doing this. And the technique is to ask someone questions. Well, I'll actually mention in schools, one of the things that they do is they teach teachers that when a student comes up and they want to have a conversation with their teacher, the teacher should start the conversation by asking them, do you want to be helped, or do you want to be hugged, or do you want to be heard? Which of course is the practical, the emotional, and the social, right? And what's interesting is that students can answer that question right away. They know what they want in a conversation. They can tell you what they need. Now, it's harder to do that at work, right? Because if you ask someone, do you want to be hugged, they might call HR on you. And so the question is, how do we do this at work? And the answer is by asking questions, but not all questions are equal. Some questions are special. And within psychology, those are known as deep questions, right? Most of the questions that we ask are surface questions. We're asking people about the facts of their life. But deep questions are questions that ask us about our values and our beliefs and our experiences. And when that can sound a little intimidating, but it's as simple as if you meet someone asking them, for instance, you find out they're a doctor. Instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? Asking them, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right? Do you like being a doctor? Is it fun? If you find out someone lives in the Heights, instead of saying, oh, do you know Jim, or what street do you live on? Asking, oh, what made you decide to move up to the Heights? Like, what do you like about your neighborhood? Those are easy questions to ask. But when we ask them, what we're doing is we are encouraging the other person to tell us something real about themselves. We're showing them that we want to learn about them. Put differently, it's better to ask, rather than asking about the facts of someone's life, it's better to ask how they feel about their life. And in doing so, when we ask them what they feel about their life, what we do is we invite them to tell us what kind of mindset they're in. Is their answer somewhat emotional? Is it somewhat practical? Is it somewhat social? That gives us a clue as to what kind of conversation they want to have. And that helps us not only match them, but invite them to match us by sharing answers to our own deep questions, which makes us feel closer to each other.
I think this leads to another question that I really wanted to discuss with you. And the question is, alongside reasoning, emotions are what makes us human. So how we feel makes us human. And we can't simply shut down our emotions at work, where sometimes if they're like negative emotions or intensive emotions, they can be frowned upon. And I think difficult emotions often arise when, we are in moments of confrontation or disagreement, or even like just discussing something with someone, whether it's about our ideas, a strategy, a plan forward, or our performance. And so how can we navigate those challenging situations more effectively? So how can we address our emotions at work effectively?
So when we have difficult conversations at work, they're not always difficult because of our emotions, right? Mm-hmm. If we have to talk about the budget, that might involve layoffs. There might be an emotional element to that, but there's equally a practical element to it, and there's a social element, right? You're talking about how people are going to treat their coworkers. So what's important is to figure out what kind of conversation you're having. Mm. And the only way we do that is by asking these deep questions. Look, we're here to talk about the budget. Jim, I know that you're anxious about this. And so tell me, what are you feeling? What's the source of that anxiety for you? I know, Susan, I know that you're thinking that we might have to lay some people off. And I want to create some time to talk about, if we have to lay people off, how we handle that in the kindest way possible, in the most humane way possible. So oftentimes we draw emotions into a conversation simply by acknowledging them, right? But what's important is that when someone hears that emotion, it's critical that they show that they have heard that emotion. So let's take, for example, here I have a slide for this. Laughter is a good example of this, right? 80% of the time when we laugh in a conversation, it is not because someone has said something funny. Rather, we laugh in a conversation to show that other person that I want to connect with them. And when they laugh back, which is the most natural response, they're showing that they want to connect with us back. Or when we're consoling someone at work or at home, and they mention something, they mention that their aunt has recently passed away. The wrong thing to do is to say, oh, I understand exactly what you mean. I have a dog that died 7 years ago. And it really matching doesn't mean mimicry. It doesn't mean that I'm saying the exact same thing you're saying. Oftentimes, the kindest thing you can do is to say, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Tell me about your aunt. Like, what was she like? The way that we connect with people, whether it be emotional or practical or social, is to listen for what they're actually telling us and then respond to that. When we're discussing something that is hard, like setting a budget or whether we're going to have to do layoffs, what's critical at that moment is not only to listen to the other person, but to prove to them that you're listening to them, to show them that you're listening. And there's actually a technique that that many schools, Harvard Business School and Stanford and Harvard Law, that they teach their students. And this is known as looping for understanding, and has 3 steps. And the first step is to ask a question, preferably a deep question. Then the second step is to summarize what you've heard. Say back in your own words what you just heard the person say. And the goal of that, of course, is to prove to them that we're paying attention or ask a follow-up question. But then the third step, this is the one that I always forget, is ask if you got it right. You know, what I heard you say is this, am I understanding you right? Did I get that? Because when we ask if we got it right, what we're actually doing is we're asking them for permission to acknowledge that we've been listening. And one of the things about how our neurology has evolved is that when we acknowledge that someone else is listening to them, we become more likely to listen in return. So the best way to get someone to listen to you is to prove to them that you're listening to them.
If we master those techniques for meaningful connections with our families, colleagues, and especially us as marketers with our customers, what would that look like? Like, what is the ultimate outcome of what happens when we show up as super communicators?
Well, I think everyone kind of knows this, right? Let me ask you, have you had a good conversation sometime in the last month?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And what made it good? What did you enjoy about it?
I think it was the openness and the way I was able to share my insights, my experience, and the way the other person responded. It made me feel seen.
Yeah. So I would say that's exactly right. That oftentimes when we walk away from a conversation, we feel good about it, right? We like the other person more. We trust them more. We feel more connected to them. Oftentimes we say things that help us understand how we think about things. You know, for marketers, obviously, who are in the communication business, many of those people on this call are super communicators. They know that communication is the most important part of business, right? It's how we connect with our clients. It's how we understand what our clients want. It's how we convince them to trust us. And when we achieve that neural entrainment, when we feel connected to someone, we're much more likely to do all kinds of things, like give them the benefit of the doubt. If you think about it, communication is essentially Homo sapiens' superpower, right? It's the thing that sets our species apart from all the other species on Earth. And the reason we've succeeded so well is because we have the ability to communicate. It allows us to build villages and families. It allows us to discover fire and share that knowledge and build aircraft carriers and video games. Communication is at the core of how we connect with other people. And it's at the center of how we are effective as leaders.
There's something that Lydia Hinchliffe, strategy director at Journey Further, talks often. She discusses, marketers' echo chambers. So these are really moments when we turn to each other, when marketers turn to another marketer for campaign inspiration or validation on LinkedIn or, at awards, rather than really focusing on making real connections with the customers that we are meant to serve. So what else can we learn from the conversations you outlined about connecting authentically with our audiences?
I think what's important is authenticity, right? Which you just mentioned. It's worth noting that, and I'll mention, so when we have a good conversation, it's often because we feel like someone is authentic and vulnerable with us, and we are authentic and vulnerable in response. And this word vulnerability, it often is misunderstood because it has a very precise definition. Vulnerability emerges as a neurological feeling when I tell you something that you could judge if you wanted to. Now, I might not care about your judgment, right? I might tell you that, for instance, I think Star Wars is better than Star Trek. And you might think that I'm totally, totally wrong. And that doesn't matter because neither of us really care about that. But by virtue of the fact that I'm telling you something that is somewhat revealing about myself, that's something that you could judge, that actually feels vulnerable to me. It sets off a sense of vulnerability in my brain. And when you respond not by judging me, but by revealing something vulnerable about yourself, then we are neurochemically designed to feel closer to each other, to feel more connected, to feel like we can trust each other more. And so this is an important insight, I think, for marketers, is that when we're dealing with our clients, sometimes by being vulnerable ourselves, saying something that they could judge, and I'm sure many people listening already know this, sometimes by exposing something about ourselves, we give them an opportunity to expose something about themselves. And afterwards, we will feel closer to each other. It's just an inevitable consequence of how our brains are designed. Eliza asks in the comments, how do you work on being a good communicator when you feel like the person you're talking with isn't listening to you? That's a great question, Eliza, because I think that one of the things that is really important is that oftentimes when we're talking to someone and they're not listening to us, it's unclear whether we think they're not listening to us or they actually aren't listening to us, right? So there's a real difference there. There are many people who are good listeners who are very, very bad at proving that they're listening. And that can be really dangerous because, in fact, I've had managers like this myself who are great listeners, but you don't know that they're listening. It's only, a couple of days later when they repeat back something and said, I remember you brought up this idea, that you realize they were paying attention the whole time. And so I think one of the things that we can do when we are talking to someone is try and interrogate a little bit. Are they actually listening to me? And the best way to do that is to ask them questions. Okay, so here's my idea. I'm just wondering, what do you think about that? Like, do you think that's going to work or not? When we ask questions ourselves, then what we're doing is we're prompting them to listen. And the truth of the matter is, if you're talking to someone and they aren't listening to you, they're just ignoring you, not really paying attention, then you don't have to have that conversation. Like, this is the nice thing about conversation, is that you never have to have it. Sometimes you get in the Uber and you don't want to talk to the driver. You just want to check your email, and that's okay. The goal here is to have the tools available to us to have a conversation when we want to have a conversation.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Thank you very much, everyone, for popping in your questions. Keep them coming. Kayla Brennan asks, how can people improve their communication skills when they struggle with public speaking?
So when it comes to public speaking, I think that one of the important things is that to realize that these same principles that we're talking about, they also matter when it comes to speaking across a stage, right? That oftentimes when I'm speaking to a room full of people, or you're speaking to a room full of people, it's very easy to get into a place where we're just going from the script that we know. But the truth of the matter is that the best speeches, and you see this in politicians doing this all the time, the best speeches are people who show you that they're listening.
Lauren asks a really, really sort of pertinent question for anyone in the professional world, particularly marketers. What is the best way to communicate negative feedback to someone in the most respectful way that shows that you hear them, you understand their emotions, but at the end of the day, you need to get across this feedback, such as underperformance or something like that?
This is so if I'm giving someone some feedback, yeah. So I think the first thing to do is, oftentimes when you give someone negative feedback, they know that it's coming, right? And so I think if you start a conversation by asking a deep question and saying, look, there's some stuff I'd like to discuss with you, but I'm just wondering before we start, what do you think about this project? Do you feel like it's been going well? Has it not been going well? Do you feel like you're struggling with it? And then showing them that I'm listening. What I hear you saying is that this has been a hard project for you for a number of reasons. One of which is you don't like working with Jim, right? And Jim's the lead on the project. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to ask you, I want to give you some feedback. And I'm just going to preface this by saying it might be a little hard to hear, right? Because I think some things aren't going well. And that's not because I don't like you, and it's not because I don't think highly of your work. It's because I want you to succeed that I'm going to give you this feedback. So what I've done there is I've started with an emotional, you've told me that you're anxious. You've told me that you're feeling something. I've shown you that I'm listening, and I've responded to that anxiety. I've spoken in an emotional way myself. I've said, look, I want to discuss this, and this is going to be awkward and hard. And then I'm essentially asking for permission to move from an emotional conversation to a practical conversation. And in doing so, I'm inviting you to come along with me, to say like, look, I've listened to your emotions. We've had a chance for us to share our emotions, and I understand those are important. Now I want to talk about how we make things better. What I think you need to do to improve. When we have conversations that way, I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah, that's a great sort of framework to work towards. We've spoken quite a bit about asking deep conversations, or particularly maybe starting a question or a conversation with a sort of a deep question about the person that you're speaking with. I think it's Naomi asks, has anyone ever responded badly to this? You know, perhaps they've thought that you're prying, or maybe they're just quite a closed off person.
Yeah, so I think that I think in general, what we've found through the research is that people don't react badly to deep questions, as long as the deep question is asked in an authentic manner, right? So one of the experiments that's often done looking at deep questions is you put two strangers in a room and you ask them to ask and answer one question, which is, when is the last time you cried in front of another person? And you would think that people would hate this, right? I actually do this when I give speeches from a stage. I have the whole room do this about midway through the speech. And I ask people if they're enthusiastic about this. And beforehand, they say, no, this sounds terrible. I don't want to do this. And then afterwards, they say, you know, that was actually one of the best conversations I've had this week. Like that was a really great conversation. They enjoyed it. Now, everyone is worried that it's going to be a bad conversation, but it's not. And I think that one of the lessons that shows us is that everyone can have a deep conversation. Everyone can answer a deep question. Now, if you go to a cocktail party and you meet the boss's wife, and the first thing you ask her is, when's the last time you cried in front of another person? It's probably not going to go over that well, right? Oftentimes we have to see a little escalation in intimacy. And in fact, that question comes from something known as the Fast Friends procedure, which is a series of 36 questions that people ask and answer each other in a laboratory setting that causes them to feel close to each other. You might be familiar with this as the 36 questions that lead to love, because some of the people who participated in the initial experiment ended up getting married afterwards.
Wow.
And I think that the lesson there is that if you set yourself up and the other person up to ask a deep question, it's going to go well. That doesn't mean that we have to ask that as the first question, right? It also doesn't mean that we shouldn't share something about ourselves. Oftentimes when we ask a deep question and it takes someone a couple minutes to think about it, it's because we're asking them something personal and intimate. We haven't shared anything of ourselves. So one of the ways to do a deep question is to say, look, I want to ask you in a second this thing. Let me tell you why I'm asking. Like, this is sort of answer the question myself. And when we share something, it invites them to share something.
I love that. Charles, thank you ever so much for your time. Apologies for the Wi-Fi issues, but it's 2024. Everyone is quite used to it by now. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you found that as insightful as I did. Be sure to sign up to the Journey Further Book Club if you can, and if you're not already a member. All the information to do so will be on our social channels. Just type in Journey Further. And Charles, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Take care.